All right, we're good.
Okay, we're on?
Yep.
Okay, well, welcome to the first week of, that is the first week of animal behavior. And the reading for this week is the first two chapters from Dawkins's book, The Blind Watchmaker. I just want to look at the syllabus to make sure I'm saying this correctly here. We did ask you to read the preface. This would be the preface to the 96 reprint. Is that right, Gavin? It is.
Okay. All right.
No, actually, no. There's a preface to the original publication, and then there's a preface to the 1996 edition. So I think the bottom line is, we'll say a few things about the preface to the original edition, because not everyone will have the 1996 edition.
Okay.
So we'll talk about the preface to the book, which really is just his sort of brief comments on what he thinks he's doing here with this book. What is the point of this book? Why is he writing it? And what might you get out of it? And then we'll cover chapters 1 and 2. And really just to sort of, ground things a little bit and sort of refresh, why we've selected this book. This is a class on animal behavior. Now, animal behavior certainly includes human behavior. And so we will be talking about humans, although most of that will come in when we discuss our second book, which is Wrangham's book, which I do have here, but I'm not going to trouble showing you. It's called The Goodness Paradox, The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence by Richard Wrangham. However, in the Dawkins book, really his examples are primarily examples from non-humans. And so a more traditional animal behavior sort of course. The point of his book, which we'll get to in just a moment, is really to make sure that we all start at the same place. The presumption that we have made is that you have not previously had any formal education in evolution or in biology or in natural selection. And so, we want to make sure everybody starts there, because that evolution by natural selection is the foundational theory for all of animal behavior. All animal behaviorists take an evolutionary perspective, whether implicitly or explicitly. That is the guiding theory for the entire field. So it's important that everybody's clear on what evolution by natural selection means and what it does not mean. That is the point for beginning with the Dawkins book. And incidentally, as I think we mentioned in our intro video, incidentally, you will get a wonderful sort of broad overview of animal behavior, because Dawkins himself was trained in the field of animal behavior. And so a lot of his examples will be, of studies and results from research in animal behavior. Okay, and I also wanted to make a couple of comments about the videos we've assigned for this week. And those, if you don't know where to find those, they are, I know Gavin sent out a Moodle message that included links to the videos. Correct, Gavin?
I posted them on Moodle, but I did not send out an announcement.
Well, I think when you post it on Moodle, are students automatically notified that something's posted?
Not via email, I don't think.
Like when I do an announcement, when I sent out the syllabus, then, well, I guess because it's an announcement, it goes out to everyone, right? Okay. So it's on you as students to make sure you keep up with things, which means go to the Moodle course webpage, and you will find there that Gavin has posted links to the first 3 videos in a 5-part series. This is a series called Growing Up in the Universe, narrated and produced in part by Richard Dawkins. And this was recorded and aired live, actually, on the BBC. It was for public consumption, public television in the United Kingdom. And this is part of the Royal Institute Christmas Lectures for Children or something to that effect. And so you'll see that there are children in the audience, but be assured that talk that's intended for a very broad audience, not just children, but for adults and for people who don't have a formal education in evolutionary biology. And so he's bringing to the public, much as his book does, he's bringing to the public, in this case, the viewing public, a broad overview of what evolution by natural selection is, why it's interesting and important, and why it's necessary to understand if you want to understand life, including human life. So we've asked you to watch the first 3 episodes. Each episode is about an hour, and you can do this on your own time. We simply ask that you do it within the next week, basically. So each week we'll be assigning various lectures or podcasts or interviews, and this is designed to supplement your reading. I think in many cases you'll hear many of the same ideas, but there'll be slightly different examples in a somewhat different context. And I think that the pedagogical principle here is that hearing about these things in different venues from different people in different contexts tends to improve students' understanding of the material. Some of you may get it when he's writing about it in The Blind Watchmaker. Others may get it when you hear him lecturing for the Growing Up in the Universe lecture series, which aired on television. So we try to work hard to bring this material to you guys in a variety of different formats, including our discussion today. Some of you will hear today's discussion, and that will cause you to click on something you heard in the video or something you read about. And then, of course, if you're confused, if you have questions or concerns, by all means, we can't force you to, but we are delighted to hear from you. Send us an email, either Gavin or myself, and help us do our. We want you to understand, but we can't. What we won't do is individually email every one of you and say, "Do you have any questions?" I mean, you guys have got to contact us, and we're happy to meet with you virtually. Okay, anything further we want to say about the videos for this week, Gavin?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, now, just to be clear, your first set of assignments will be due this week, right?
Yeah, Saturday
in fact,
at 9.
By Saturday at 9, you should have written, submitted, posted discussion questions, 4 to 5 discussion questions that you have from the reading for that week, which will be chapters 1 and 2 in the preface. You should also, by 9 o'clock on Saturday, have responded to at least 2 other students' questions, okay? And finally, by 9 a.m. on Saturday, you should have submitted your first reaction paper. The reaction paper should be 2 double-spaced pages, okay, and can address anything you wish to address, something that grabbed your attention, something you're confused about, something you, in contrast, might have really thought you understand, and you find it particularly interesting. That's up to you. That you will submit by 9 a.m. Saturday, and you will find on the webpage the locations to submit these reaction papers.
Yep.
We're not looking for a particular reaction. What we're looking for, and similarly, we're not looking for particular questions or particular responses. We're looking for evidence that you're engaged with the material, okay, that you're thinking about the material, that you're struggling with it, okay, that you're asking questions, that you're honestly reacting intellectually to the material, okay? So do let us know if you have any questions, but I think we'll leave it at that. You will receive full credit so long as you get the material, you get your assignments in on time, and it's clear to us that you are engaging with the material. Notice that I didn't say, and that we haven't said, we need evidence that you're an expert on the material. We don't need that. We need evidence that you're engaging with the material. Okay, if you were an expert, you wouldn't be taking this class. All right, anything further I can say about that, Gavin?
No, I don't think so.
Very good then. Well, let's open it up and talk about the preface. How about that?
Yeah, yep.
All right. So I'll sort of, you jump in where you wish, Gavin. We'll just kind of, our goal here is to have as much as possible a sort of discussion, always keeping in mind that this is, this is for this class, and we're doing our best to identify areas where our experience suggests that students have a little more trouble, or we want to point out ideas or examples that we think are particularly important for students to understand. So the preface, which again is really his effort to sort of say, why did I write this? And what he's saying right at the beginning here is that there is a problem that remains to be explained, okay, or that has to be explained, and that is the problem of what he calls complex design, okay? And in the particular case of application to biology or application to animal behavior, the question is how to explain apparent complexity of design. Now, before Darwin, of course, the explanation was obvious to everyone, and it was that God did it. That was the leading explanation for complex design. I mean, birds have, wings that are so beautifully designed for flight because that's the way God made them. What Darwin, and at the same time Wallace, Darwin is most famously recognized for the theory of evolution by natural selection. What Darwin did is he provided a natural explanation, that is, a non-supernatural explanation for complex design. And what he argued is that given variation in some traits, okay, and given that some of those variations cause greater likelihood of surviving and reproducing, and therefore passing on those very traits that made survival and reproduction more likely, what you will see over evolutionary time is the emergence of complex design, of features such as the wing of a bird, okay, the feathers of a bird, the brain of a human, okay, the heart of a human. These are all complex, what he referred to as adaptations. Basically, specialized machines that do a particular task or solve a particular function. And Darwin argued that one doesn't need to invoke a supernatural entity that has produced this trait, but instead, such a trait will emerge over evolutionary time, given the various features that he identified: variation, selection for some traits over others, and then retention, the passing on of those traits to offspring. So we'll talk much more about this, but part of what he's doing is pointing out that there is something to be explained here, and that something is complex apparent design. And again, before Darwin, the explanation was God, either a god or gods or some supernatural entity that poofed that trait into existence, or that species into existence. What at the time, the leading theory was referred to as special creation, as discussed in Genesis. He argues in the preface, he points out that not only is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection capable of explaining complex design or adaptations, okay, but he actually argues in one place that, as a matter of fact, it is the only known theory that could, in principle, solve the mystery of our existence and of all complex design. Scientifically speaking, okay, one can argue that God poofed humans into existence, but that really just pushes the question back. And you can say, okay, fine, God poofed us into existence. Okay, but then a very reasonable next question would be, well, who poofed God into existence? And then when the response is something to the effect, well, God has always existed, and and there never was a time when there wasn't a God. Well, that sort of response requires the person you're talking with to basically take on face value that the God you're referring to, keeping in mind there are thousands and thousands of gods, that the specific God you're referring to definitely did and does exist. But that's that's requiring much more of your listener, of the person you're talking with.
Right. And I think, isn't it in the preface somewhere that Dawkins, he says that he himself probably would have been a creationist before the 1850s, when, Darwin proposed his theory. And I think that's him sort of saying how difficult a question this is and how seemingly complex the design is, that, before the theory of natural selection was sort of laid out and explained, it would have been fairly reasonable to evoke a supernatural explanation for, apparent design.
No doubt about it. Yes, I don't know if he writes about it in the preface, but he's been very vocal about Dawkins himself was a creationist. He was raised as, in the Anglican Church, and until he discovered Darwin's work, he absolutely thought, as did most of his fellow students and teachers, that special creation was the cause for apparent design. And, it's worth noting that Darwin himself was a creationist. I mean, he himself was deeply persuaded by a leading author of the day. Strangely, I can't remember his name. William Paley. William Paley, who wrote actually have a copy. It's beautifully written, and the book, it was written, I think, in 1802. It was published in 1802, and it was regarded as nailed it, that kind of book. He argued that the complexity of design proves a God. The fact that birds are so beautifully designed for flight proves that there's a God. Now, this was before Darwin, of course. But this is a book that Darwin read and reread, and that Dawkins read and reread. And in fact, it is beautifully written, and it's entirely compelling. But it does require a supernatural element, a poofing into existence, which again requires that you take on board precisely that God that is being argued for, and that you don't ask questions about where that God came from. So yes, Dawkins himself, as a child, was a creationist, and Darwin himself, as a child and then as an adult, until he was in his early 20s, is when he started having serious questions, as he discovered, these various, actually, as he noted, variation among very closely related species. So it's a good point, and it's also a point that I think, Gavin, you're right to emphasize, that the apparent design in nature, almost begs for us to make, an attribution of supernatural sort of origin. Because anything, here you have this beautifully crafted adaptation, super complicated, designed to do a particular task. It must have been created by a god or gods. I mean, if humans didn't do it, well, then something, with human-like intelligence and foresight must have done it. But that's precisely what Darwin is arguing against, that there must be a supernatural creator. In fact, he's arguing that there is no supernatural creator. There is no supernatural designer. Hence the subtitle of the book. It's called The Blind Watchmaker, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. And The Blind Watchmaker is a play of sorts on Paley's argument regarding a watchmaker. And what Paley argues is that if you're, walking along a beach, for example, and you stumble upon a rock, well, a rock is a very simple object that doesn't require an explanation. For all you know, the rock's been there for as long as the earth has been there. But if you instead are walking along and, stumble upon a watch, pick the watch up, look at it, it's super complicated, it's designed to do a particular task, well, a watch implies a watchmaker. Similarly, Paley argues, a bird is super complicated and implies a bird maker. Who is that bird maker if not man or humans? Well, it's God. Okay, and what Darwin is arguing is we don't need to take that step. Instead, Darwin presents a natural explanation for all of the complexity of life.
Right, and that's sort of what he's doing in this first chapter, I believe, is
Yes.
sort of setting up the extended metaphor of the blind watchmaker as a sort of alternative analogy to, Paley's watchmaker.
That's right. So the problem is, how do you explain the very improbable? If we go to chapter 1 now, explaining the very improbable, right? And so actually, I've actually churned into chapter 1 a little bit with the reference to William Paley. And that argument, this is on page 7, his book was called Natural Theology. Look at the subtitle, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, that is God, collected from the appearances of nature. And it's important to keep in mind that before Darwin, really, all naturalists were religious leaders. They were clergymen. And what they were doing when they studied nature is what they thought they were doing was studying the mind of God. To study a bird is to study the mind of God because God created the bird. And so it was referred to as natural theology. Theology is study of religious teachings. Well, natural theology was the study of nature to gain insight into God. And this argument, which is a very powerful argument, is called in some ways very powerful. It's called the argument from design. When you see design, that implies a designer. Okay, so Paley argued, as you see design in nature, that's proof of God. Okay, and Darwin, as he relays here, Darwin was very moved by this explanation, as were many of his colleagues and fellow students of the day. There's a couple of great quotes in here where on page 9, Dawkins writes, Paley's argument is made with passionate sincerity and is informed by the best biological scholarship of his day. But it is wrong, gloriously and utterly wrong. The analogy between telescope and eye, between watch and living organism, is false. All appearances to the contrary. The only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. Then he goes on to say, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. Natural selection has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker, hence the name of the book.
And you mentioned, or in his quote, he mentions the blind forces of physics, and that reminded me that also in this chapter, I think another helpful thing that he does is he sort of breaks down the different layers at which you might be able to explain natural selection, and he, sort of walks the reader through, although, yes, natural selection is ultimately the result of physical forces and chemistry, and, even chemistry at a very zoomed in level is really just physics. It's in many ways not exactly helpful to talk about natural selection in terms of like subatomic particles and
right
at that level. So I that just reminded me that he also sort of makes that point in this chapter, I believe.
Yes, he does. Yes. I think it might be a little bit later. He does talk about, I see where he's talking about reductionism and what that means and does not mean. Yes, then he goes on to talk about the distinction between physics and biology. And so we'll get to that. But in short, that's right. I mean, from a biologist perspective, from the perspective of animal behavior, it's not especially useful to talk about, to try to explain a bat's behavior in terms of quarks or photons. of course, one could do such a thing, but that would be an explanation that might be offered by a physicist. Okay, a biologist is interested, or an evolutionist, a biologist is interested in explaining animal behavior with reference to adaptations, with reference to the machinery of the body and the machinery of the mind, of the brain. With the presumption that, of course, there are quarks and there are photons and there are all sorts of things going on at the level of subatomic particles. But an explanation at that level of reductionism is not typically useful in the field of animal behavior, where you're sort of dealing with much bigger objects.
Right.
So it builds on rather than it's not an alternative level of explanation. It's a different type of explanation. So yeah, it's good to point that out for sure. So let's see, on page 11, he asks, so what is a complex thing? How should we recognize it? And this is middle of page 11. In what sense is it true to say that a watch or an airliner or an earwig or a person is complex, but the moon is simple? The first point that might occur to us as a necessary attribute of a complex thing is that it has a heterogeneous structure. Okay? It has different parts. Okay? The thing that you're trying to explain. Okay? He says, this will often amount to saying that a complex object, as opposed to a simple one, has many parts, these parts being of more than one kind. Such heterogeneity or many-partedness may be a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. And he goes on to say that Mont Blanc, a particular mountain, consists of many different kinds of rock, all jumbled together. It has a heterogeneity of structure, not possessed by a particular pudding, I think he says, the blancmange, but it's still not complex in the sense in which a biologist uses the term. Okay, and this is important. Okay. Now, well, there's many ways in which we can tackle this, but he says, suppose we try out the following definition, top of page 12 here. He says, a complex thing is something whose constituent parts are arranged in a way that it is unlikely to have arisen by chance alone. He says this approach to a definition of complexity is promising, but something more is still needed. There are billions of ways, he says, of throwing together the bits of Mont Blanc, it might be said, and only one of them is Mont Blanc. So what is it that makes the airliner and the human complicated if Mont Blanc is simple? Okay. Okay. Then he says, all right. This is on page 15. He says, if, no matter how randomly you threw matter around, the resulting conglomeration could often be said with hindsight to be good for something, then it would be true to say that I cheated over the swallow and the whale, in this particular example, but biologists can be much more specific than that about what will constitute being good for something. Okay? The minimum requirement for us to recognize an object as an animal or plant, and therefore as complex in the way that we're talking about in animal behavior, okay, is that it should succeed in making a living of some sort. Okay, more precisely that it, or at least some members of its kind, should live long enough to reproduce. It is true that there are quite a number of ways of making a living, he says, flying, swimming, swinging through trees, and so on. But however many ways there may be of being alive, it is certain that there are vastly more ways of being dead, or rather, not alive. Okay, and then he, so he's recognizing that he's taking you through a lot of different thought experiments. And he says at the bottom of page 15, this has been quite a long, drawn-out argument, and it is time to remind ourselves of how we got into it in the first place. Okay, he says we're looking for a precise way to express what we mean when we refer to something as complicated. Okay, the answer we have arrived at, top of page 16, is that complicated things have some quality specifiable in advance that is highly unlikely to have been acquired by random chance alone. In the case of living things, the quality that is specified in advance is, in some sense, proficiency, either proficiency in a particular ability, such as flying, as an aero engineer might admire it, or proficiency in something more general, such as the ability to stave off death, or the ability to propagate genes and reproduction. Okay, so what is complex, what he means by complex or complicated, what animal behaviorists and biologists mean by complex or complicated, is it is some quality, again, specifiable in advance, such as the ability to fly, okay, that is extraordinarily unlikely to have been acquired by random chance alone.
Right. So he's sort of, in a way, it seems like he's sort of reminding the reader of, his explanation in the preface, or what he was saying about how, seemingly or very complex things do sort of demand some sort of explanation other than random chance, because they're, like you said, extremely unlikely to have arisen by chance alone. And also, do we want to define sort of what Dawkins means when he says making a living? So, like, when
Sure.
Biological life, when things are making a living,
yeah,
Dawkins is
what does he mean?
Referring to surviving and reproducing, basically.
Yeah. And what are some ways?
Yeah, so I think he talked about, different animal designs, so primates, insects, but also viruses survive and reproduce by infecting other organisms, for example.
Yeah, birds fly, fish swim, humans, navigate for the most part on land. These are all different ways of making a living, by which he means, again, surviving and reproducing.
Okay? Which all involve different adaptations, such as like
Correct.
flying and the swimming. And those, in and of themselves, can be sort of the complex pieces or, subjects which demand explanations other than random chance.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, just thinking about what he means there is think about if you took all of the cells, that make up a bird, okay, just randomly jostling them together is all but guaranteed not to produce a bird. Okay. As he says, most of those random conglomerations of cells won't produce anything. Okay, I mean, they'll produce a lump of tissue or something. There are many more ways of not being alive than of being alive and being functionally organized to do something. So all of this leads to a discussion, well, maybe not leads to, but this leads into a discussion, which we've already touched on, of, this notion of hierarchical reductionism. And all of this is discussed in part because Dawkins is interested in making sure his reader understands what it means to explain something. Okay, what it means to, to what extent do you reduce, is your explanation, sort of, does it reference? Let me back up. We talked about how there are many levels at which you can explain something. There's the level of physics where you're caught up talking about photons and quarks, and subatomic particles. That is not going to be particularly useful for explaining how birds fly or how fish swim. Okay? That is a higher level of analysis that assumes the truth value of physics. But as he says at the top of page 22, reductionism, in this sense, is just another name for an honest desire to understand how things work. Okay, and he says, further on on page 22, he says, a complicated thing, sorts of things we've been talking about: a bird's wing, a human's heart, okay, the human brain, things that can't possibly have just poofed into existence by chance, okay, things that appear to be designed to do something. A complicated thing is one whose existence we do not feel inclined to take for granted because it is too, quote, improbable. It could not have come into existence in a single act of chance. Okay? I mean, the only thing that can come into existence, the only things that poof into existence are the incredibly simple things. Okay? You must begin with simplicity. You can't get from nothing to extraordinary complexity. Okay? Probabilistically, you can't get there. Okay? Unless, of course, you invoke a supernatural entity, in which case you've now opened a whole different can of worms. Because now, of course, you've got to explain, that supernatural entity. Gavin, is your sound on?
Yeah. No, I can. Sorry, I can hear you. And I was about to jump in and say yes. So in a lot of ways, it sort of feels like Dawkins is setting his parameters between, on the one hand, not invoking supernatural explanations, finding causal links or causal explanations for biological life, and on the other hand, trying not to zoom in so far that we're sort of missing the point or missing the relevant aspects of how by non-random chance or by non-random selection complex biological organisms could come into existence.
Yes. Yeah, and in fact, as you were talking, I thought it might make sense to go ahead and draw students' attention to right after that very statement that I quoted on page 22. He's talking about how to explain a complicated thing. He said, it could not have come into existence in a single act of chance. We shall explain its coming into existence, he says, as a consequence of gradual, cumulative, step-by-step transformations from simpler things, from primordial objects sufficiently simple to have come into being by chance. Just as big step reductionism cannot work as an explanation of mechanism, poofing complexity into existence, and must be replaced by a series of small step-by-step peelings down through the hierarchy, so we can't explain a complex thing as originating in a single step. We must again resort to a series of small steps, this time arranged sequentially in time. Okay. Now, he closes with reference to the complexity of the eye, and that something as complex as the eye, could not possibly have come into existence in precisely that form, in one fell swoop. This very fact was a powerful element of William Paley's explanation for the existence of God. Because the eye is so complicated and has so many interlocking features that it must have been produced in one fell swoop. And it was produced by God. It had to have had a designer. Darwin tackled that very example. He actually took the bull by his horns, so to speak, and said, well, let me offer you an explanation, such as it is at that time, for the complexity of the eye. And he points out that, there is a huge range of variation from a single light-sensitive cell all the way to what we might call a quarter of an eye, to a half of an eye, to three-quarters of an eye, to a fully functioning human or eagle-like eye. And so, in other words, he suggests it's not that it's entirely plausible that the eye, as we see it in humans, evolved. That is, step by step over, vast expanses of time. And so what that does is it takes off the table any reliance on supernatural explanations, which again get you into all sorts of difficulties.
Right. And the eye is sort of a fun example because it's been used by both creationists and Darwinian evolutionists to sort of and by adaptionist thinkers to sort of explain that, like you said, you don't need a supernatural explanation to explain the eye. It could have evolved step by step, with each step providing, sort of an advantage to its owner.
Must have provided an advantage to its owner.
Right.
However small or apparently trivial that advantage was, so long as there was an advantage, well, then that little baby step in that direction will have been selected. Okay? And again, there's no selector. There's no, master designer here. It's what happens, okay, over evolutionary time when there are individual differences, and some of those individual differences produce consequences for survival and reproduction. Okay, and assuming those individual differences are heritable, well, then they become more prevalent in the next generation. Okay, so shall we move on to chapter 2?
Yeah. So then that kind of is a good transition, because after he gets done talking about the eye, he then dedicates the entire next chapter to talking about adaptations in bats for using sonar or echolocation.
Right. And I really like the way he sets up the chapter right at the beginning. Okay, so this is the mark of a good writer. You remind your reader of what you just told them, okay, and then why that's important for what you're about to tell them. So he says right at the beginning, natural selection is the blind watchmaker. Okay, blind because it does not see ahead, does not plan consequences, has no purpose in view. I mean, it's just a process. There is no grand being, that is naturally selecting. Okay, some traits are selected, others aren't. Okay, he says, yet the living natural selection overwhelmingly impress us with the appearance of design, okay, like the human eye, as if by a master watchmaker. They impress us with the illusion of design and planning. Okay, the purpose of this book is to resolve this paradox to the satisfaction of the reader, and the purpose of this chapter, that is chapter 2, good design, okay, the purpose of this chapter is to further impress the reader with the power of the illusion of design. Okay, we shall look at a particular example and conclude that when it comes to complexity and beauty of design, Paley hardly even began to state the case. Okay, and so what he does is he spends this chapter, that's right, sharing with the reader the unbelievable amount of complex design, apparent design, we should say, required for bats to echolocate. Okay, for them to be able to see, that is by hearing, to navigate darkness, and not just to clumsily navigate it, but to navigate it exquisitely, so much so that they can track down and capture insects who, for all their worth, are trying desperately not to be captured. Okay, and yet bats succeed. That suggests a wonderful level of complexity, of adaptation, that's allowing them to do this. Okay. He says here towards the beginning, he says, this is the second paragraph, he says, we may say that a living body or organ is well designed if it has attributes that an intelligent and knowledgeable engineer might have built into it in order to achieve some sensible purpose, such as flying, swimming, seeing, eating, reproducing, or more generally, promoting the survival and replication of the organism's genes. Okay, he says it's not necessary to suppose that the design of a body or organ is the best that an engineer could conceive of, just that it's better than alternatives. Okay? So then he introduces us to, okay, the problem that most bats have, many bats have. Okay, and he says, the middle of page 30, this is what you might call the adaptive problem, or one of a class of adaptive problems. He says bats have a problem, how to find their way around in the dark. All right, they hunt at night and cannot use light to help them find prey and avoid obstacles. Okay, you might say that that if this is a problem, it is a problem of their own making, a problem that they could avoid simply by changing their habits and hunting by day. But there are lots of other things that hunt by day, and that niche is sort of already filled. So the problem is, how do you get around and get what you need in darkness? Okay? They've got an engineering problem. Okay? How to find their way and find their prey in the absence of light. Okay? Well, how might they do this? Okay? And so he goes on, page 31, he says, given the question of how to maneuver in the dark, what solutions might an engineer consider? He goes through a variety of possibilities. Okay? They might evolve huge eyes, or eyes that are capable of taking whatever light there might be. And there are a few bats that have sort of moved down that path, although they also echolocate. There are some bats, notably fruit bats, that have very, very large eyes, which they have to have, given they hunt at night. But an alternative would be to take advantage of other sorts of sensory information. Okay, and if it's not light, what about sound? Okay, and as it turns out, that's precisely what bats have evolved to do, to navigate, okay, by echolocating.
And this is sort of where I think it's helpful that he sets up the parallel of echolocation in submarines and how humans sort of independently designed, like you said, how would an engineer solve this design problem? And
That's right.
so each step along the way of explaining echolocation in bats, he sort of explains a similar sort of step that engineers used when solving the problem of echolocation. So the problem of, how do you find your way around when there's no light, and then all of the other subsequent problems that come with that we'll go into shortly. I'm sure I don't want to give away too much, but
Right. Did you think that was interesting, though, that Griffin, was it Donald Griffin? Yeah, Griffin. Anyways, a guy called Griffin, a biologist, he's the one that demonstrated that bats must echolocate. He basically proved it to an audience, and people were outraged. His fellow biologists and government engineers were outraged that a stupid little bat had a beautifully, apparently designed system for navigating with sound. And there were even suggestions that someone had espionage and sort of digging into files and finding out what the Army or the Navy had been doing, and right, it makes it very very clear the parallels between human engineering and the engineering problems that natural selection solves. And in this case, what you have is evidence of convergent sort of solutions.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so he's talking about just the amazing, features that make possible echolocation in bats. I mean, they're able to make, moment-to-moment shifts in flight, and on the basis of these clicks that they're giving, we can't hear them because they're outside of our range. Ultrasonic, right? Ultra only is a very speciesist way of talking.
Right.
Higher than humans can hear is what it means. But they make these little click sounds, and they send the sound out, and then they wait for it to return and calculate distance. We know they're doing this. We know they're obviously not doing it consciously, and no, they don't have a mini calculator tucked away under their arm or something. But their minds are built to make these calculations. It's really quite amazing, and you can see the illusion of design is very powerful. And you can also appreciate how before Darwin, everyone was a creationist. Wasn't it obvious that this kind of complexity demands, a designer, that is, a god? There's a wonderful sentence here. I think wonderful piece of literature, really. On page 34, he says, "These bats are like miniature spy planes, bristling with sophisticated instrumentation. Their brains are delicately tuned packages of miniaturized electronic wizardry, programmed with the elaborate software necessary to decode a world of echoes in real time. Their faces are often distorted into gargoyle shapes that appear hideous to us until we see them for what they are, exquisitely fashioned instruments for beaming ultrasound in desired directions. It's really cool. So then he gets into a little more detail. I don't know if you want, shall we say a little bit about, maybe let's say a little bit about some of the problems that the use of echolocation. So echolocation is the solution to an adaptive problem, but the very solution creates a series of additional problems.
Right.
Maybe you can say something about one of those problems.
One of the ones that I remember specifically is the issue of sort of volume, producing a loud enough sound so that it travels a sufficient distance and, you know, provides a useful sort of like audio image for the bat. The issue then being that if you produce something loud enough, then it could damage the eardrums of the bat who is producing it. And so the sort of evolved solution, the adaptation to this issue, is that the bat's eardrum, I can't remember exactly how, but it's some sort of disconnect in the hammer anvil stirrup setup of the bat's ear, and by it disconnects as soon as the bat creates the sound, the pitch, and then reconnects as soon as it's done. That way, you know, the eardrum is effectively closed off while the pitch is being created, and then reopens in order to receive the reverberations back.
Right, and it's. I mean, if you just stop and take a breath and think about this, that means that there is yet a further level of complicated machinery operating, you know, in the bat's brain, that's finely coordinating sounds with the structures, you know, that allow sound to come in, so that the ear is not damaged. There has to be a dramatic and quick reduction of any kind of sound coming in while the bat emits its sound, but then it has to open back up in time to catch the often millisecond return. Okay, so it has to constantly in coordination with the workings of the sound producing machinery, and that's, you know, I mean, that requires extraordinary complexity insofar as it demands, you know, incredibly specific timing.
Yeah, and I mean, also on the matter of timing, he also talks about how bats sort of avoid getting feedback from other bats pitches or the sounds that they make, and not getting confused with them. And I forget some of the exact details of these adaptations, but I know one he talked about was sort of how bats use sort of an oscillating pitch that
wolf whistle and
sort of sliding pitch that goes up and down in a certain frequency so that they don't confuse the reverberations of their own pitch with the cries or reverberations of other bats.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, it's amazing because bats are highly social animals and typically and can live in, you know, conglomerations of millions, and they're all clicking, you know, to navigate, and so that machinery has to be so finely tuned to recognize own clicking, you know, own sounds, and not the other 999,999 bats that you share a cave with. So it's really, I think it's a wonderful example, you know, for the illusion of design, the illusion of design. So he gives you, you know, lots of details on, you know, how bats do this, and, you know, for our purposes, we're not asking you to, you know, to become an expert on echolocation. It's our goals as instructors of this class are the same as Dawkins's, which is simply to share with you, to communicate the powerful illusion of design. Okay, it's the illusion of design that depends on, or that follows from, this amazing amount of fine-tunedness. okay,
Right.
and special apparent design. So on page 52, he's starting to wind down his discussion of bats to some extent, and he says, our experience of electronic technology prepares us to accept the idea that unconscious machinery can behave as if it understands complex mathematical ideas. Okay, all the various things that your computer does, or for that matter, a calculator. Okay, this idea is directly transferable to the workings of living machinery. He says a bat is a machine whose internal electronics are so wired up that its wing muscles cause it to home in on insects as an unconscious guided missile homes in on an aeroplane. So far, our intuition derived from technology is correct, but our experience of technology also prepares us to see the mind of a conscious and purposeful designer in the genesis of sophisticated machinery. This is what he means by the power of the draw of apparent design. He says it is the second intuition that is wrong in the case of living machinery. In the case of living machinery, the, quote, designer is unconscious natural selection, the blind watchmaker, not a god or Zeus or Beelzebub or any other sort of supernatural entity. Okay, he again brings it back to Paley, and he says Paley's hypothesis was that living watches, such as birds, okay, were literally designed and built by a master watchmaker, namely the Christian God. Okay, our modern hypothesis is that the job was done in gradual evolutionary stages by natural selection. Okay, then he addresses a few other arguments against natural selection, one of which is called the argument from personal incredulity, which is a very common sort of argument, which basically can be summarized as, well, I can't believe it. I personally can't imagine how natural selection could build an eye, a complex human eye over vast periods of evolutionary time, because I personally can't see how a single light sensitive cell over evolutionary time could step by step result in a fully functioning human or eagle eye. Okay, right. What he says is the argument from personal incredulity is an extremely weak argument, okay, as Darwin himself noted. Just because just because you find it, impossible, or personally incredulous, doesn't mean that natural selection couldn't have built whatever it is you're talking about.
Right.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Gavin, on the argument from personal incredulity.
Not really, just because it's I feel like it's really not any explanation at all. It's really just a lack of an explanation. It's sort of just like throwing your hands up and saying, well, like you said, I personally can't conceive of how this could have happened, but that doesn't mean, even if a biologist or a naturalist, which in Darwin's time that was the case, a naturalist evoking that sort of explanation still is not any kind of satisfying explanation to how it could have arisen. And even if it sort of defies a current level of understanding, a modern level of understanding of biological life or natural selection, doesn't mean that natural selection couldn't have done it, and that we won't at some point figure out how it could be possible. So,
yeah, the argument from personal incredulity is basically a conversation stopper. It basically says, well, I don't know. I can't believe how it could have been done, so therefore it couldn't have been done. And therefore, let's talk about something else.
Right.
It's not super conducive to scientific progress. It's not super conducive to identifying any kind of explanation. Okay, so in the last few pages, Dawkins addresses, what is so difficult about an evolutionary explanation, why there are so many, why people why we're even talking about the argument from personal incredulity. So he makes reference to a particular bishop who, and this might be Paley. No, it's a different bishop. A leader of the Anglican Church. And it's not relevant who this particular person was. But anyways, this particular bishop at the top of page 57 goes on to the human eye, asking rhetorically, and with the implication that there is no answer, how could an organ so complex evolve? Okay, implying that, well, it couldn't. Okay, but then he's saying, Dawkins says, this is not an argument. It's simply an affirmation of incredulity. All good?
Oh, yeah, sorry, my dog was freaking out.
Oh, yeah, no problem. He says the underlying basis for the intuitive incredulity that we are all tempted to feel about what Darwin called organs of extreme perfection and complication is, I think, twofold. He says, first, we have no intuitive grasp of the immensities of time available for evolutionary change. Okay, I mean, it is weird and strange to think in terms of millions of years or hundreds of thousands of generations. The human mind is built to think in terms of days, weeks, years, and then things start getting kind of fuzzy.
Right.
You think about how our ancestors spent most of their time, most of their days. It wasn't fooling around thinking about, the origins of the universe in any sort of deliberate, thoughtful way. So he says the second basis for our natural incredulity about the evolution of very complex organs like human eyes and bat ears is an intuitive application of probability theory. Okay? And he says, it just seems so intuitively improbable, okay, that all of the necessary features that make up a human eye poofed into existence in that form, so complex as it is. But of course, that's not how the human eye came into existence. Okay? The human eye is the endpoint, or the current endpoint of a very rich and lengthy evolutionary history. Okay, as traits evolved, or as from a single light-sensitive cell all the way through to what we now recognize as the complexity of a human eye. So he says, so he's quoting a particular author. Well, it's a particular bishop who's quoting a particular author on the subject of cuckoos. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds, which then act as unwitting foster parents. Like so many biological adaptations, that of the cuckoo is not a single adaptation, but it's multiple adaptations. And then this author goes on and says, not Dawkins, he says, it will be seen that each of this sequence of conditions is essential for the success of the whole. Yet each by itself is useless. The whole opus perfectum must have been achieved simultaneously. The odds against the random occurrence of such a series of coincidences are, as we have already stated, astronomical. And then Dawkins says, arguments such as this are in principle more respectable than the argument based on sheer naked incredulity. Measuring the statistical improbability of a suggestion is the right way to go about assessing its believability. Okay? Indeed, it's a method that we shall use in this book several times, but you have to do it right, says Dawkins. There are two things wrong with the argument put by Raven, by the author we just quoted. First, there is the familiar, and I have to say rather irritating, confusion of natural selection with randomness. Dawkins reminds us that mutation is random. Natural selection is the very opposite of random. Okay? It's selecting particular traits that happen to be those that increase the likelihood of survival and reproduction. Second, it just isn't true that each by itself is useless. It isn't true that the whole perfect work must have been achieved simultaneously. It isn't true that each part is essential for the success of the whole. A simple, rudimentary, half-cocked ear, eye, echolocation system, whatever it is better than none at all. Without an eye, you are totally blind. With half an eye, you may at least be able to detect the general direction of a predator's movement, even if you can't focus a clear image. and this may make all the difference between life and death. Okay, and these matters, he says, will be taken up in more detail in the next 2 chapters.
And I wanted to touch on that because I was really glad that he sort of gave some attention to that issue in this chapter, because I was thinking as I was reading the parts about echolocation how it could very well be difficult for some readers to sort of, read all of these adaptations that seem like they must only exist simultaneously, like specifically the eardrum adaptation that helps bats from damaging their eardrums, and then their very loud clicks that they make in order to get reverberations from their environment. And
Right.
I think, although Dawkins doesn't lay out specifically how it happened, and I'm not sure if there is a detailed account of how specifically those different adaptations did come into existence, I think he is sort of saying or arguing that those things very well could have evolved gradually and sort of, at least initially, independently of one another, like maybe echolocation first, and then
Sure.
before it was too developed or too loud or whatever, sort of slight adaptations that helped close off the eardrums started to develop, or something like that, for example.
Right. Not only could that have happened, but it must have happened. It
Right.
must have happened that complexity began not as complexity, but as simplicity. You can't go from nothing to complexity. You can only get to complexity by stages of much greater simplicity, all the way up. That's the only way we know, okay, for complex apparent design to emerge.
Right.
That's the way it does emerge, and that's the only way it can possibly emerge. I mean, as a matter of fact, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is often, it's sort of an old school criticism. No. Darwin himself laid out various findings that would obliterate his theory. I mean, if you identified a trait that could not possibly have evolved gradually from more simple to current complexity, that would utterly destroy his theory of evolution by natural selection. That is, so it's 2 sides of the same coin. If you did document that a complex trait could not possibly have evolved, okay, from simple to complex, that would destroy evolution by natural selection. Similarly, if you could provide evidence of a trait coming into existence from nothing to extraordinary complexity, that too would destroy evolution by natural selection. Neither such trait has ever been identified, and not for lack of trying.
Right.
You appreciate that there are many people who have spent many, many, many years attempting to identify the very traits or processes that would utterly undermine evolution by natural selection. And such traits have never been identified to the satisfaction of, the scientific community. That is reliable, that you can, cross-check and make sure, what they say they found is what they found, and so on.
Right.
All right. Anything further we want to say on these first 2 chapters of the preface?
No, I'm good.
Okay, well, we'll presume that if you guys have questions, you'll provide them in the discussion forum. But always feel welcome to reach out to Gavin or I. We're happy, more than happy, to talk about this material. We actually think it's pretty cool. So, all right then. Thank you, Gavin.